Hello to everyone in the Hill Life group. This is Corey Huggins, and we are going to be analyzing the second half of the book of Ruth, primarily chapter 3 and 4. Jeff covered chapter 1 last week. So we'll do a quick recap of chapters 1 and 2 and then move on to our lesson. So as we go about this study, I want you guys to think about a question here. Looking back over the hard times of your life, how did God use an unlikely person to advance His purposes through your difficulties? So think about that. There's going to be a direct correlation between that question and three characters, Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. So the setting of the book of Ruth can be captured in the first half of the first verse, actually. It says, during the time of the judges. Now, we know throughout our extensive study over the last several weeks of the book of Judges, kind of what was going on, and it can be summed up really in chapter 17, verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever he wanted. So you can see that, and when we know from our previous studies that there was a cyclical sin, suffering, supplication, and salvation focus in various stages and throughout different vantage points throughout the book of Judges. But we're going to extract the story of Ruth from that time period. Now, the purpose of the book of Ruth was actually to demonstrate the kind of love and faithfulness that God desires for each and every one of us. It shows the difference between what happens when a nation does not follow in obedience to the covenant of God and really when God's people follow in faithfulness, as we'll see in Ruth. So the second half of Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 states, there was famine in the land. And what that did was it persuaded Elimelech and his wife Naomi. They had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and the famine actually caused them to move to a land called Moab. Now, whenever they arrived in Moab, Mahlon and Chilion married two Moabite women. Mahlon married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah. And after living in Moab for about 10 years, at that point, Chilion, Mahlon, the two sons, as well as Elimelech, the father, had all died. So Naomi makes a request in chapter 1, verse 12, says, return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. So she's telling her daughters-in-law to go and find someone in your own land who can go and provide for you, that she was going to return home to her homeland. And Orpah, who's Chilion's wife, or was Chilion's wife, actually does. Now Naomi, who was Mahlon's wife, Ruth, who was Mahlon's wife, does not. She replies back in chapter 1, verse 16, do not persuade me to leave you or go back and not follow you. For whenever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. So, since Naomi decides to return home to Bethlehem alone, Ruth, she insists on staying, and she's going to adopt Naomi's God as her own. Ruth remains loyal to her mother-in-law Naomi after the death of her husband and in-laws, and she actually makes a trip back to Bethlehem with her. And they're welcome with excitement, but as we see in chapter 1, verse 20, Naomi's not too excited to return to her homeland in this current state. She says, call me Mara. Do not call me Naomi, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. So she's returning home to her homeland with a Moabite woman who used to be, I guess kind of technically still is, her daughter-in-law. But her husband has passed away, and her sons have passed away. Now, as we pick it up in chapter 2, Ruth decides to take initiative and harvest some grain for Naomi, and what that does is it results in an encounter with Boaz. Now, Boaz is tied to Elimelech's side of the family. And he's described as a prominent man of noble character. He's very devoted to the Lord and this shows by his blessings to others. And Boaz hears of what Ruth is doing for Naomi, and he allows her to work in his fields and pick up really whatever food is necessary to help provide for Naomi. And Naomi says to her daughter-in-law in chapter 2, verse 20, may he, he's talking about Boaz, may he be blessed by the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living or the dead. Naomi continued, the man is a close relative, and he is one of our family redeemers. Now, the family redeemer would do two primary things. One would be to fulfill the levirate marriage, which is a type of marriage where the brother of a deceased man is obliged to marry his brother's widow. Likewise, the widow is obliged to marry her deceased husband's brother. So the second primary thing for a family redeemer, they were responsible for ensuring the dead man's land stayed in the family. Okay, so we kind of have the setting here of Naomi, her daughter-in-law Ruth is providing for her, and she results in an encounter with a prominent individual from Elimelech's side of the family, and Ruth makes an appeal to Boaz as we pick it up in chapter 3. And although our curriculum starts in 8, I'm going to go ahead and read 1 through 7 here. Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, my daughter, shouldn't I find security for you so that you will be taken care of? Now isn't Boaz our relative? Haven't you been working with the female servants? So she's basically wanting to provide for Naomi here. Naomi's wanting to provide for Ruth here by finding a man, and that will in turn actually help provide for her as well. As we continue on, this evening he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume oil, and wear your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he's lying. Go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do. So Ruth said to her, I will do everything you say. She went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had instructed her. After Boaz ate, drank, and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley. Then she went in secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. So you can kind of see the setting here. Naomi is telling Ruth, she's giving her a strategic plan of how to arrange this private meeting with Boaz, who's the perfect person at this point for her to become engaged to, or to have a relationship with, someone who can provide for both Ruth and Naomi. So in verse 8 it states, at midnight Boaz was startled, turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. So he asked, who are you? I am Ruth, your slave, she replied. Spread your cloak over me, for you are a family redeemer. So Ruth did all this at midnight, and as anybody would be startled if someone was lying there by your feet at midnight. Boaz was very taken back by this, right? But Ruth had serious business to discuss, as she was dressed appropriately, had perfume on. This determines not only her security, but Naomi's. So Ruth defines herself. She immediately responds back to him after he states, who are you? She immediately defines herself as a lower social status than he is, right? She states, I am Ruth, your slave. She replied, spread your cloak over me, for you are a family redeemer. Now, the word cloak literally means wings in Hebrew, and it's the same terminology used in chapter 2, verses 12. And Ruth is actually proposing to Boaz. His blessings would fulfill both Ruth and Naomi if he would fulfill that role. So we're going to pick it up in chapter 3, read verses 10 through 13 here. Then he said, let's look at Boaz's response. May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness than ever before. So he's stating that he's understanding what she's asking. This is something that is above and beyond their encounters prior to. Because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people of my town know that you're a woman of noble character. So he says, don't be afraid. You're going to be provided one way or another. Okay? In verse 12, yes, it is true that I'm a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. So it's either going to be Boaz or the closer family redeemer that will end up providing for Naomi and Ruth. So this is verse 13 is a great display of integrity of both Ruth and Boaz. They wanted that relationship, but they also wanted it to be legitimate, and they wanted it to be legal. All right, as the second half of verse 13 states, "Let him redeem you, but if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lay down until morning." So the next morning, as the events unfolded with 10 men of the town's elders, the nearest kinsman was interested in redeeming Mahlon's land, but didn't because it would ruin his own inheritance. So that resulted in Boaz kind of being the next man to the plate, if you will, and allowing Boaz and Ruth to become married. And chapter 4, go ahead and read verses 13 through 17 here. This is after they get married. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he was intimate with her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Praise the Lord, who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and took care of him. The neighbor women said, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. You can kind of see how this story ends. It ends with a brighter future for Naomi. Ruth could actually raise an heir to Mahlon's name and heritage, while Boaz was given a wife and a mother-in-law. He was given a family as well. The bitterness that Naomi had returning back to her homeland was almost gone away because of the joyful living that she would have with her kind of new in-law, as well as her grandchild. So if some way Naomi had interpreted the death of her husband and sons as the Lord being against her, she must now see that was not the case, that he was definitely in favor for her. And by that she was given to a son who was named Obed, which actually means servant in Hebrew. And towards the end of verse 17, it states that Obed was the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now, we all know David was the greatest king God's people really ever had. All the kings were measured by David. And to kind of recap everything, God surprised the widow Ruth by giving her a new husband, right, in Boaz, and a child of her own to raise. He surprised Boaz by giving him a wife. Most of all, God surprised Naomi, by whom he chose to bring about his redemptive purposes. And that was a baby named Obed. Ruth, Boaz, and Obed were all ancestors of Jesus, who is our ultimate Redeemer. There are times in our lives where we think things have gone wrong, and unforeseen circumstances, and think that God is against us and not with us. But as we can see here in the story of Ruth, that's not the case. We are redeemed, we are secure in the life and the hope of Jesus and his return once again to each and every one of us. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week.